August 1945, Luzon. We were the Japanese comfort women POWs, shocked when Americans took us to a beauty salon. We expected barbed wire, we braced for the worst. Instead, we were given soap. An interpreter for the U.S. Sixth Army said we were protected persons under Geneva rules. We were fed, and our hair was washed. But every kindness felt more dangerous than a weapon. Our own propaganda had taught us what to expect from these devils. This mercy could only be a trick. If your enemy restores the dignity your own side took away, is it freedom or a more perfect cage? Tell us where you're listening from and the local time there. We want to see how far these testimonies travel. If remembering hidden truths matters to you, subscribe to help us share them. The trucks came in August 1945, kicking up the tired dust of Luzon. The Pacific War was finally burning out, its embers scattering across the islands. For 22-year-old Keiko and the other women huddled in the back of the American convoy, the world had shrunk to the rhythmic jolting of the axle and the silent fear in each other's eyes. They were prisoners now, property of the enemy. They had been labeled comfort women by the Japanese Imperial Army, a name that disguised a truth they all lived but never spoke. They had been moved from one garrison to another for years, becoming ghosts in their own lives, their bodies turned into instruments of the war effort. Now that the war was lost, they prepared for the final, violent payment. Propaganda had drilled the images into their minds. The leering American devils, monstrous and cruel, who would take what was left of them before casting their bodies aside. Keiko covered her face with her hands, not to hide from the soldiers, but to hide from herself. Her hair was a matted tangle, her skin raw with sores and blisters. She felt soiled, less than human, and shame was a hotter fire than the Philippine Sunday. The convoy of U.S. Army trucks rolled to a stop, not before a barbed wire cage, but in front of a small, commandeered building in a village still bearing the scars of recent fighting. It had once been a local beauty salon. Keiko's mind reeled. This had to be a mistake, a prelude to some special kind of humiliation. The American soldiers who opened the tailgate were not the monsters from the posters. They were young, their faces showing not malice, but a kind of weary duty. They moved with a calm that was more unnerving than any threat. A corporal, his face barely old enough to need a razor, offered them soap and combs. Another soldier, an interpreter with the U.S. Sixth Army, stepped forward. He was a man named James Carter, and his Japanese was careful, almost formal. He explained the situation without emotion. Orders were clear, he said. They were officially classified as prisoners of war. They would be treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. Rules. Keiko flinched at the word. The only rules she had known were the ones written on her body by force and fear. This new world, with its impossible language of protection and procedure, felt like a trap. One by one they were led inside. The salon was a strange mix of military order and civilian life. The ornate chairs were still there, but tubs of hot water had been hauled in by U.S. Army medics. A Filipino hairdresser, a man named Manuel Reyes, had been pressed into service, his face a careful mask of neutrality. Supervising it all were American nurses from the Army Nurse Corps, their movements crisp and efficient. One of them, a lieutenant named Margaret Hill, guided Keiko to a chair. The nurse's hands were gentle as she began to wash Keiko's hair, working the soap into a lather, her touch professional but not cold. Keiko kept her eyes shut tight, waiting for the blow that never came. Another American joked that the shampoo they were using was stronger than artillery. A few of the women tittered nervously. The sound was thin and fragile, like birds testing their wings after a storm. Then Lieutenant Hill began to hum. It was a light, easy melody, a swing tune that spoke of dance halls and peacetime. It was the first music Keiko had heard in years that was not meant for marching men into battle. For a moment, her shame was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of simple, forgotten humanity. This act was not random, it was policy. Between February and August of 1945, forces under General Kruger's Sixth Army had captured over 3,000 women and civilian camp followers across Luzon. The 1929 Geneva Convention did not have a special category for comfort women, but its articles were clear. Any captured non-combatants under enemy control were to be treated as protected persons. Field orders from command stipulated medical cleansing, adequate food, and humane housing. The Salon episode was unusual, a flash of creative implementation, but its purpose was deliberate and twofold: restore the women's dignity and cut the risk of disease spreading through the camps. It was a mission of both mercy and medicine. The American officer in charge, a medical captain named Robert Hayes, watched from a distance. He was a cautious man, balancing the needs of his patients against the rigid expectations of military conduct. To him, the women were a logistical problem requiring a humane solution. For Keiko, the gentle scrubbing of her scalp felt like a dangerous miracle. After her hair was clean and combed, a soldier held up a small mirror. Keiko stared at the reflection, at the unfamiliar face of a young woman with clean hair. It was a ghost of someone she used to know. The soldier smiled, a simple, uncomplicated gesture, as if she were a guest and not a captive. The crack in Keiko's propaganda-laced reality widened. That night, they were housed in a clean barracks and given POW rations: rice, canned peaches, and Spam. The women ate in a tense silence, each bite a negotiation between gnawing hunger and the lingering fear of poison. Keiko watched the others. Some were beginning to chatter, their voices slowly returning. But she held on to her suspicion. The devils of the propaganda posters were vicious, but they were predictable. These quiet, rule-following Americans were a mystery. Kindness from an enemy felt more dangerous than their cruelty ever could. It asked for a kind of trust she no longer possessed. She clutched the bar of soap she had been given, its clean scent a stark contradiction to the filth of her memories. The day had been an assault of gentle gestures, each one chipping away at the fortress of fear she had built around herself. She did not know what to believe, but as she lay down to sleep, one thought echoed in her mind. If the Americans were not the devils she had been taught to fear, then who were the real monsters in her story? The days that followed the beauty salon were a strange, suspended reality. After the initial quarantine period, the women were moved to a more permanent holding area. It was clean, orderly, and eerily quiet. The American soldiers kept their distance, performing their duties with an impersonal efficiency that was neither cruel nor kind. Yet small acts of humanity continued to break through the routine. One afternoon, the interpreter, Corporal Carter, brought them paper and pencils. They were allowed to write brief letters. For women who had been cut off from their pasts, the simple offer was overwhelming. Some wrote feverishly to families they hadn't seen in years, their words a torrent of stored-up love and fear. Others, like Keiko, wrote to no one. She found a scrap of cloth and traced characters onto it with a piece of charcoal, releasing words that had no destination, simply needing to exist outside of her own mind. It was an act of remembering she was a person who had thoughts, who had a name, who had a story before the war had tried to erase it. This policy of measured compassion was a deliberate component of the American occupation strategy in the Philippines. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the Allies were fighting a propaganda war as fiercely as they had fought with bullets and bombs. The Japanese had painted them as barbarians, and every act of disciplined restraint was a counter-argument, showing that captured non-combatants, especially women who had been systematically abused by the Japanese military, were not only safe but protected under international law, sent a powerful message. It was a demonstration of moral superiority, a way to prove that Allied discipline held even in the chaotic aftermath of battle. Medical reports from camps like the one in Luzon documented the horrific toll of the comfort women's system: malnutrition, rampant venereal diseases, and the psychological scars of forced abortions and relentless servitude. The numbers were staggering, with estimates suggesting anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 women across Asia had been forced into the system. In the face of such calculated cruelty, the American response, providing food, medical care, and small dignities, was designed to be a stark and visible contrast. One evening, as twilight settled over the camp, an American GI sat on a crate nearby, cleaning his rifle. When he finished, he pulled a harmonica from his pocket and began to play. The tune was slow and melancholic, a simple melody that drifted through the barracks windows. A few of the women, drawn by the sound, giggled nervously. Others began to weep silently, their shoulders shaking with a grief they had suppressed for years. For Keiko, the music was another key turning in a lock she had long thought rusted shut. It spoke of homes and quiet evenings, of a world that existed beyond orders and violence. The soldier played without looking at them, as if the music was for himself, a private comfort in a public space. But it reached them all the same. It was another crack in the wall of propaganda, another piece of evidence that these men were not the one-dimensional monsters she had been taught to hate. But this growing realization brought a new kind of fear. If the Americans were not devils, then the evil she had endured was not a simple matter of war between enemies. It was something more personal, more intimate, inflicted upon her by men who looked just like her brothers and father. Lieutenant Margaret Hill, the nurse who had washed Keiko's hair, saw the subtle shifts in the women each day. In her field journal, she documented not just their physical recovery, but their fragile emotional states. One evening, she wrote a short entry. "They looked stunned when we combed their hair. One girl cried when we painted her nails. She said it was the first time she felt human in years." Her words captured the immense power of these small gestures. For women who had been treated as objects, being seen as a person was a profound shock. Yet Keiko could not fully let go of the deep-seated suspicion. Each day was a trial. The kindness felt conditional, temporary. She watched the guards, scanned the faces of the medics, listened to the tone of the interpreters, searching for the lie. This careful treatment, this adherence to rules, felt like a performance. It could not be real. She whispered her fears to one of the older women, who simply shook her head. "Maybe it is a trick," the woman said softly. "But for now the food is real, the sleep is safe. That is enough." Keiko wanted to believe her, but the voice of the propaganda was a persistent ghost, whispering that this mercy was just another mask of power, designed to fool them before the final, terrible truth was revealed. Weeks after the harmonica music had faded, a new order arrived. The women were being sent home. Repatriation. The word itself was a foreign country, a place of impossible hope. The journey back to Japan would be made on a hospital ship, another sterile, ordered environment run by the Americans. As Keiko boarded the vessel, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was no longer a captive, not yet a citizen. She was a passenger in limbo, caught between a past she couldn't escape and a future she couldn't imagine. The ship moved with a steady, deep rhythm across the Pacific, its white hull a symbol of neutrality and healing. On board, the care was efficient, the food was plentiful, and the American nurses treated them with the same detached professionalism as before. But the gentle humming and easy smiles were gone, replaced by the serious business of transport. The women were cargo, human cargo, being returned to their port of origin. During the long days at sea, Keiko found herself replaying the memory of the beauty salon. The feel of the warm water on her scalp, the scent of the soap, the reflection in the mirror, it had become a secret touchstone, a moment of impossible grace in a world of brutality. Who would ever believe such a story? As the ship neared the coast of Japan, a low gray haze hung in the air. It was not fog, it was the dust and smoke of a nation brought to its knees. Keiko stood on the deck with the other women, straining for her first glimpse of home. What she saw broke her heart. The vibrant port city she remembered was gone, replaced by a graveyard of skeletal buildings and rubble-choked streets. The air tasted of ash. This was the homeland they had been fighting for, the sacred ground they had been taught to die for. It was a ruin. The shock of the physical devastation was only the beginning. As they disembarked, the true nature of their homecoming became terrifyingly clear. There were no welcoming committees, no tearful family reunions. Instead, they were met with silence and sideways glances. The authorities who processed them were grim-faced and bureaucratic, their questions sharp, their tone laced with a subtle contempt. They were no longer comfort women, no longer prisoners of war. They were a problem to be managed, a stain to be quietly wiped away. When Keiko finally made her way back to what was left of her neighborhood, the silence turned into whispers. The whispers followed them from the ration lines, from the communal water pumps, from the shadows of burned-out homes. "You were the Army's women." The phrase was a brand, seared onto them by the very people they had longed to see. Families looked away. Old friends crossed the street to avoid them. The shame they had felt in captivity was nothing compared to the shame of their return. In the American camp, their status had been clear. They were protected persons, victims of a war they did not start. Here, in their own country, they were seen as collaborators, as damaged goods, as living symbols of a defeat so total it had shattered the nation's soul. The mercy they had been shown by their enemy was incomprehensible in this new world of bitterness and blame. How could Keiko explain the American nurse who hummed a swing tune while washing the lice from her hair? Who would believe the story of the soldier who held up a mirror so she could see her own face again? To speak of such a thing would be a betrayal, an insult to the suffering of her own people. It would be seen as a lie, or worse, as proof that she was truly ruined, her loyalties as tangled as her past. The memory of the beauty salon, once a source of quiet wonder, now became a source of burning, secret shame. She hid it away, burying it deep inside herself. That single act of kindness, which had momentarily restored her humanity, now isolated her completely. The Americans had given her back her dignity for an afternoon, only for her own nation to strip it away for a lifetime. The contrast was a cruel, unanswerable riddle. She sat in the wreckage of her former life. The bar of American soap, tucked away in a small cloth bundle, its clean scent, a haunting reminder of a kindness that now felt more like a curse. Was mercy ever safe to trust? Or was it just another mask of power, a more sophisticated weapon designed to break you in a way that fists and boots never could? The question settled in her heart, a piece of shrapnel that could never be removed. The decades that followed the war were a long, unbroken silence. Post-war Japan, in its desperate rush to rebuild and reinvent itself, buried the uncomfortable truths. The story of the comfort women was one of those truths, pushed into the dark corners of the national memory. For Keiko, and for tens of thousands of women like her, silence was the price of survival. She never spoke of the garrisons, of the fear, of the endless parade of soldiers. And she certainly never spoke of the day her hair was washed by an American nurse in a commandeered salon in the Philippines. The memory was hers alone, a strange and contradictory treasure. It was a secret she guarded for 50 years, a small flame of a memory that neither flickered nor faded. She married a quiet man who never asked about her past, raised children who knew nothing of her lost youth, and grew into an old woman whose face was a map of unspoken sorrows. The world moved on, but a part of her remained in that moment, staring at a reflection in a mirror held by an enemy's hand. Then, in the 1,990 seconds, the silence began to break. One by one, survivors, now grandmothers in their 70s and 80s, began to step forward. Their testimonies, delivered in quavering but determined voices, painted a devastating picture of systematic cruelty and exploitation. The world finally began to listen. As historians and journalists dug into archives, a more complex picture emerged. They found official Japanese military documents detailing the logistics of the comfort stations, undeniable proof of a system the government had long denied. They also found American military reports from 1945 detailing the capture and processing of these women. One declassified U.S. Army report from the Philippines noted the unusually positive morale effect that resulted when captured women were treated in ways that restored their personal dignity. The account of the beauty salon, once just a single private memory, was echoed in these dry, official documents. It was not just Keiko's imagination, it was a recorded event, a footnote in the vast bureaucratic machinery of war. The mercy had been real, it had been policy. For Keiko, now elderly and frail, the emergence of these stories was a profound and unsettling validation. For so long she had doubted her own memory, wondered if the kindness she experienced had been a hallucination, a dream born of desperation. Hearing other women speak, seeing the official records, she finally understood. Her experience was not an anomaly, it was part of a larger, more complicated truth. The war was not just a story of monsters and victims, it was also a story of small, inconsistent acts of humanity that defied the simple narratives of good and evil. One day, sitting in her small, quiet apartment, She took out a small, yellowed piece of cloth. On it, the faint outlines of charcoal characters were still visible, the words she had written to no one in the American camp so many years ago. She finally allowed herself to remember the Salon not with shame, but with a sense of wonder. In that 1 hour, she had been seen not as property, not as a spoil of war, not as a tool for propaganda, but simply as a person whose hair was matted, whose spirit was broken, but who was still worthy of a moment of gentle care. The war took her youth, her family's honor, and her place in society. It branded her with a shame she carried for a lifetime. But that one, incomprehensible act of mercy remained. It could not undo the years of trauma, nor could it heal the wounds inflicted by her own people upon her return, but it had given her something small and indestructible. The enemy's soap and comb, the nurse's humming, the soldier's smile, they had delivered a message more powerful than any propaganda. They had told her she was still human. In a world of barbed wire and brutal rules, sometimes the sharpest cut is not from a weapon, but from the unexpected kindness no one ever told you was possible. It was the kindness that had isolated her, yes, but it was also the kindness that had quietly, stubbornly, kept her soul alive.